In addition to the material from the Crash Course series, I wanted to provide you with a short video to emphasize a few points about a big topic. Don't feel overwhelmed. First, as the video from the West Point professor reminded us, have no doubt the Civil War was about slavery. There are a few serious scholars who might argue about this, but they are vastly, overwhelmingly outnumbered. I would, however, like to make that statement just a little more precise. The war was about the expansion of slavery. If they had been confident that slavery would have remained where it was, remained where they believed and hoped it would wither and die, the vast majority of Northerners would have been willing to allow slavery to continue, in the short term at least. The difficulty was that at every territorial expansion of the United States, the question of the expansion of slavery arose. So the big questions were: first, would slavery be allowed to expand? Second, who would decide? Third, how to maintain the appearance of a sectional balance of power, that is, equality between North and South. The first test of expansion concerned the Louisiana Purchase way back in 1803. Who would decide whether in 1817 Missouri would become a slave state or not? The answer then was Congress, and the Missouri Compromise was born. The next big test was the land acquired from Mexico, the so-called Mexican Cession, Cession. Congress decided that maybe it did not want to make such difficult decisions. So, popular sovereignty, that is, allowing residents in a territory to vote on slavery, was established for part of the cession. The Compromise of 1850 was born. It was hardly born before it was busy dying. 1850 was the beginning of a decade that historians describe as the sectional crisis. So, in order to remember the major phases of this crisis, think of it as a baseball game, where instead of 3 strikes, there were 6 strikes that led to the Civil War. All of the strikes undermined people's beliefs about the status of the expansion of slavery. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, part of that compromise, made Northerners feel that they were active rather than passive participants in slavery. As Lincoln pointed out, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 took this newfangled idea of popular sovereignty and applied it to the Louisiana Purchase, a place where Northerners had believed the question of the expansion of slavery had long been settled. When Northerners attempted to use popular sovereignty to prevent slavery in Kansas, it seemed to them that there was no chicanery or barbarity that border ruffians would stop at to spread slavery. Then Dred Scott confirmed the fears of Northerners that the slave power, as described in the Crash Course video, was busy framing a house of slavery throughout the Union. Lincoln and the Republican Party became the refuge for Northerners from the Whigs, Democrats, and Know-Nothings who feared the expansion of slavery. They also were well aware of speeches of men like Senator Albert Gallatin Brown. Then the shoe was on the other foot. For Southerners, not just the expansion of slavery, but the survival of slavery in the states where it already existed, seemed threatened by Northern attitudes to John Brown and the election of 1860. 6 strikes, and 7 states were out. There were, however, a couple of more innings to be played. One of the most important parts of this lethal game was to keep the border states on your side. Between the election of Lincoln and the attack on Fort Sumter, some final desperate measures were taken to keep the border states in and, believe it or not, attempt to woo the states of the new Confederacy back. Just how desperate? Well, let's consider the story of the two 13th Amendments that were approved by two-thirds of the Congress and submitted to the states for the required ratification by three-fourths of the states. In December 1860, the House of Representatives and the Senate, with the help of Republicans and the acceptance of President-elect Lincoln, approved the following proposed amendment to the Constitution. Quote, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state." And yes, the first 13th Amendment was intended to guarantee slavery in the states where it already existed. It was never ratified. The polar opposite of the 13th Amendment now, which freed the enslaved. So, why did some Republicans support this amendment and Lincoln not oppose it? The amendment did not interfere with their fundamental opposition to the spread of slavery, which they believed would ultimately kill slavery. They had a slogan you would do well to remember. Quote, "Freedom national, slavery local." End quote. That is, freedom was the default, the ordinary condition in the United States, beginning with the Declaration of Independence. Slavery was a local institution that the founders had been so ashamed of that they would not use the word in the Constitution. The founders, the Republicans asserted, had compromised with slavery because they believed it would eventually wither and die. They, the Republicans, would wait for it to die and hope to preserve the Union. However, when the Southern states refused to accept the limitation of slavery and the election of Lincoln, war came. And yet, Lincoln and the Republicans still hoped that the Union might be restored if they made no move to abolish slavery. It was only the unexpected difficulty of the war and the fear that the Confederacy, like the infant United States, might gain the recognition of foreign powers, Britain and France, eager for Southern cotton, that made Lincoln finally willing to use his power as the commander-in-chief as an act of war and abolish slavery in the rebellious states. It should also be pointed out that Lincoln was also pushed to this extremity, this radical move, by the fact that the enslaved, whenever and wherever they could, were freeing themselves. They were marching into Union lines. Likewise, Lincoln was willing to allow General Sherman to lay waste to any supplies in the South that he could not buy or carry with him. Sherman and Grant made total war hell for the South. I want to leave you with some idea of the cost of the Civil War. One contemporary aptly referred to the nation as, quote, "this republic of suffering." A portion of this you have heard before with regard to the second middle passage. It is worth repeating. To start with, there is the obvious question of blood. The Civil War was by far America's deadliest war. The true measure is not simply the highest number of deaths from battle, but the number of deaths as a percentage of the population. In World War I, there were 109 deaths per 100,000 people. In World War II, there were 241 deaths per 100,000 people. In the Civil War, there were 2,000 deaths per 100,000 people. In the South, 25% of men between the ages of 25 and 40 died during the course of the war. After blood, there was the cost in treasure. In 1860, before the war, the federal budget was $63 million. By 1865, the federal budget was $1.3 billion. The Confederate budget was probably another $1 billion. The costs did not end with the war. By 1893, the federal government spent $159 million on pensions for veterans and their dependents. In 1894, pensions accounted for 37% of the federal budget. As of 2016, a pension for the 86-year-old daughter of a Union veteran continued to be paid. Aside from budgets and pensions, the cost and destruction was staggering. Two-thirds of the assessed wealth of the South in 1860 had been destroyed by 1865. 40% of the livestock and half of the farm machinery were destroyed as well. The bitter symbol of this destruction was Sherman's march from Atlanta to the coast of Georgia. While Sherman paid for supplies, in a bid to hasten the end of the war, he destroyed anything in his path that might be of use to returning rebel troops. The grief of the war was magnified almost beyond endurance by the fact that there was often no tomb to visit. 40% of the Union dead and even more of the Confederate slain were unidentified. Even the joy of freed slaves was mixed with bitter gall. The roads were full of freed men and women, not only those who had fled to Union lines to escape bondage, but also husbands in search of wives sold farther south, or mothers desperately hoping to recover children auctioned to the highest bidder or given away as the dowry of an enslaver's daughter. When by luck or providence the lost were found, there were often bitter scenes, where the separated spouse found that her beloved, in resignation to seemingly hopeless circumstances, had taken up with another. The poisonous tree of the interstate slave trade continued to bear a melancholy fruit. The magnitude of the problem can be seen in the pitiful algorithms that the Freedmen's Bureau drafted as, quote, marriage rules to, quote, correct as far as possible one of the most cruel wrongs inflicted by slavery. In those rules, well-meaning commissioners looked to solve the insoluble. Here are a couple of examples. Section 1.3. All married persons producing satisfactory evidence of having been separated from their companions by slavery for a period of 3 years, and that they have no evidence that they are alive, or if alive, that they will ever probably be restored to them, may be allowed to marry again. Section 4.6. If a man living without a wife find 2 wives restored to him by freedom, the one having children by him and the other not, he shall take the mother of his children as his lawful wife, unless it be shown cause as provided in Section 3. Section 5. If a woman living alone be claimed by 2 former husbands, she shall be free to accept either, provided there be no moral or legal objections, as provided in these regulations, against either party. If, however, she has children who are minors by one only, she will be required to accept the father of her children as her lawful husband. I hope that this short and incomplete catalog of the problems of this republic of suffering gives you a better understanding of the complexity and gravity of the Civil War.